The elevator doors opened onto the top floor of Sutton Boot and Leather Company, and before Wade Sutton had even stepped fully into the hallway, he heard her voice cutting through the quiet like a blade dragged across leather. You don't get to walk back into this building and undo 6 years of my judgment, because some stray you found on the street batted her eyes at you. Wade stopped mid-stride. Diana Ashford stood in the doorway of her office, arms crossed, chin lifted in the particular way she carried herself whenever she believed she was protecting something. Behind her, through the glass wall, the floor of the executive suite had gone still. Phones stopped ringing. Keyboards stopped clicking. Every person on that floor understood instinctively that something dangerous had just been said out loud. Say that again, Wade said quietly. You heard me the first time. Diana's voice did not soften. If anything, it sharpened the way it always did when she felt cornered. You built this company with your bare hands, Wade, and now you're going to hand out jobs to whoever makes your chest feel warm. People like her don't belong in a place like this. They don't understand loyalty. They understand survival. And people who only understand survival will use anyone who lets them. Welcome to our YouTube channel. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch today's video. Before we begin, we would love to know where you are watching this video from. What time is it where you are right now? And which country are you joining us from? Is it the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Canada, or somewhere else in the world? Please leave a comment and share it with us. It would be truly wonderful if people from all around the world could connect with one another, share their stories and feelings, and spread kindness and love through every video. Thank you for becoming a part of our community. We hope you enjoy a meaningful, peaceful, and heartwarming time watching this video. The words landed somewhere low, in Wade's stomach somewhere old. For a fraction of a second, something behind his eyes flickered, not anger, not yet, but a memory trying to surface before he shoved it back under. Careful, Diana, he said, and his voice had gone very still, the stillness of a man who had learned a long time ago that shouting rarely won anything worth winning. You're talking about a woman you interviewed for 12 minutes. I built this company. I know exactly what kind of people build something out of nothing because I used to be one of them. Diana's jaw tightened. That's different, and you know it. Is it? He said. Not a question. A wall going up. He didn't wait for her answer. He turned and walked into his own office, and Diana followed him in, closing the door behind her with more force than necessary. I rejected her because she wasn't qualified, Diana said. Her resume had gaps. No formal training. No references from anyone with a name that means something. I made the call any reasonable hiring manager would have made. You rejected her, Wade said, sitting down slowly behind his desk. The same afternoon I told you I was sending her your way personally. That's not a coincidence, Diana. That's a message. Silence. Fine, Diana finally said, and something in her voice cracked open just slightly, revealing what had been underneath the whole time. Maybe I don't want to watch you throw yourself away on some girl with nothing to offer you. Maybe I remember exactly where you came from, Wade, and I don't want to watch you drag it back into your own life. The room went quiet in a way that felt heavier than before. For a long moment, Wade said nothing. He looked down at his hands. Hands that 20 years ago had been cracked and bleeding from stitching leather by lamplight in a room with no heat. Hands that had once shook so badly from hunger that he'd dropped an awl and cut his own palm, and hadn't been able to afford stitches for it. He looked at those same hands now resting on a mahogany desk in an office 42 floors above the Fort Worth stockyards, and something in his chest twisted. You don't get to use where I came from as a weapon, he said finally, and his voice had dropped so low that Diana had to lean in slightly to hear it. Not against her. Not against anyone. Wade, reinstate her interview file. Today. And if there's any professional reason, any real one, that she isn't fit for the position, I want it in writing on my desk by 5 o'clock. Otherwise, she starts Monday. Diana stared at him, searching his face for the boy she barely remembered, the one who'd once shown up to a trade fair in boots he'd made himself out of a torn saddle because he couldn't afford real leather. She didn't find him. She found only the man he'd built on top of that boy, calm and immovable, and she understood she'd already lost. You're making a mistake, she said, quieter now. Maybe, Wade said. But it's mine to make. She left without another word. The door clicked shut behind her, and Wade sat alone in the sudden stillness of his own office. The city sprawling gold and gray beyond the window. Cattle trucks crawling along the distant highway toward the old stockyards where his whole life had once fit inside a single cardboard box. He closed his eyes. For a moment, he wasn't a billionaire anymore. He was 17 years old again, curled into the corner of a bus shelter on a January night. So cold, the wind seemed to reach straight through his jacket and settle into his bones. his stomach hollow, his hands wrapped around a thermos that had gone cold hours before. He remembered exactly what it felt like to be looked at the way Diana had just looked at Ivy Malone's application, like a liability, like a risk, like someone whose poverty made them suspect, rather than someone whose poverty simply meant they hadn't yet been given a fair chance. He opened his eyes. The memory receded, but it left something behind the way it always did, a low ache, familiar and unwelcome, that he had spent 20 years trying to outrun by building something no one could ever again tell him he didn't deserve. He picked up his phone. That evening, in a small rented room above a laundromat on the east side of the city, Ivy Malone sat on the edge of a narrow bed staring at nothing. The rejection email still glowed faintly on the screen of her secondhand phone. Though she had read it so many times, the words barely registered anymore. "We have decided to move forward with other candidates." 12 words. 12 words that felt, after everything, like one more door closing in a life that had been mostly made of closing doors. She hadn't cried. She'd promised herself a long time ago that she wouldn't waste tears on things she couldn't fix. But her hands folded tightly in her lap wouldn't stop trembling. When the phone rang, she almost didn't answer. Unknown number. Probably another collections call. "Hello, Ivy Malone." The voice on the other end was low, steady, and she noticed with some confusion, careful, almost gentle, the way a person spoke when they were choosing their words with real thought rather than habit. Speaking. "This is Wade Sutton." For a moment she couldn't breathe. She knew the name the way most of Fort Worth knew it, off the side of delivery trucks, off billboards near the stockyards, off the cover of a business magazine she'd once flipped through in a waiting room because she couldn't afford to buy anything else to read. "I owe you an apology," Wade said. "What happened today with your interview that wasn't fair to you, and it wasn't the decision I would have made. I'd like you to come in Monday morning. The position is yours if you still want it." Ivy sat very still, gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. "Mr. Sutton, I don't understand. I know what you thought," he said quietly. "You were wrong. And for what it's worth, Ivy, I know exactly what it feels like to be told you don't belong somewhere before anyone's even given you the chance to prove otherwise." On the other end of the line, something in Ivy's chest, something that had been clenched tight for longer than she could remember, loosened just slightly. Not trust, not yet, but the smallest, most fragile beginning of it. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much." "Get some rest," Wade said. "Monday's going to be a good day." He ended the call and sat alone in the dark of his office, long after the building had emptied around him, staring out at the lights of a city that had once nearly swallowed him whole, wondering not for the first time and not for the last why. A stranger's voice on the other end of a phone call had reached somewhere inside him that he'd thought was closed for good. The next morning, Ivy woke before her alarm the way she always did on days that mattered not from rest but from a body too wired with nerves to allow anything close to peace. Gray light came in thin through the blinds of her small rented room, falling across a floor bare, except for a single suitcase she had never fully unpacked in 3 years, as if some old tired part of her still expected to have to leave at a moment's notice. She sat up slowly and reached for her phone, half convinced that the call from the night before had been some cruel trick of exhaustion, that she would find no record of it at all. But there it was, a missed call log, a name she still could not quite believe, Wade Sutton. She stared at it for a long time before finally setting the phone down and pressing both hands flat against her knees to keep them from shaking. She had learned a long time ago not to trust good news too quickly. Good news in her experience usually came with a price tag attached, or a catch hidden somewhere in the fine print, or a person standing just behind it waiting to take it away again the moment she let herself believe in it. She had learned that lesson first at 9 years old in a house that was never quite a home, and she had learned it again and again in the years since, each time a little more thoroughly than the last. She got up, made coffee she couldn't really afford, and stood by the window of her small kitchen watching the laundromat below slowly come to life for the day. Somewhere out past the rooftops, past the highway, past the long gray stretch of the city, was a glass tower, where a man she had spoken to for less than 2 minutes had just changed the entire shape of her week. Monday, she thought. Just get to Monday. That weekend passed the way most of Ivy's weekends passed, quietly, carefully stretched thin across a budget that left no room for anything but the essentials. She pressed her one good blouse with an iron that had been second-hand when she bought it second-hand again from someone else. She counted out bus fare twice to be sure she had enough for the week. She sat at her kitchen table on Saturday night with a legal pad, writing out in small, careful handwriting everything she wanted to remember to say if anyone asked her why she deserved this chance. And then sometime after midnight she quietly tore the page out and threw it away, because some tired, wounded part of her understood that no amount of preparation had ever been enough to stop people from deciding long before she opened her mouth exactly what kind of person they thought she was. She thought more than once of calling someone to share the news, but there was no one, not really, no family to call, no mother to tell, no father who had ever wanted the job. There had been foster homes, 6 of them by the time she aged out of the system, and there had been a handful of kind faces along the way, who had tried in their own limited ways to make her feel like she mattered. But there was no single number in her phone she could call at 10 o'clock on a Saturday night and simply say, "Something good happened to me today," and hear someone on the other end, who had been waiting her whole life to hear it. So she sat with it alone the way she had learned to sit with most things alone, and let herself feel just for a moment something dangerously close to hope. Monday morning arrived gray and cool, the kind of early autumn morning in Fort Worth where the air still carried a memory of summer, but the light had already started turning towards something softer. Ivy stood outside the glass doors of Sutton Boot and Leather Company 40 minutes before her scheduled start time, unable to make herself go in any earlier, unwilling to risk being even a minute late. The building rose above her, all steel and glass, and quiet, expensive confidence, nothing at all like the cracked sidewalks and sagging porches of the neighborhoods she had grown up moving between. She smoothed the front of her blouse, tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and reminded herself silently the way she had reminded herself 1,000 times before walking into 1,000 rooms that did not want her in them. You belong here as much as anyone else does. Act like it, even if you don't feel it yet. At exactly 8:55 she stepped through the doors. The lobby was enormous, all pale stone and hushed acoustic sunlight falling in long, clean columns from windows 2 stories high. And there, near the security desk, standing with his hands in the pockets of a gray suit that fit him the way expensive things fit people who had learned slowly and painfully how to wear them without apology, was Wade Sutton. He looked up the moment she entered, and for a fraction of a second something crossed his face that Ivy couldn't quite name, not surprise, not quite recognition, but something older and quieter than either, as if some part of him had been waiting for her without knowing it. "Miss Malone," he said, crossing the lobby toward her. His voice in person was even more careful than it had been on the phone, low, unhurried, the voice of a man who had learned that most people only needed someone to actually listen to them, and so rarely got the chance. "I'm glad you came. Thank you for calling me, Mr. Sutton," Ivy said, and heard with some embarrassment how small her own voice sounded in the enormous open space of the lobby. "I almost didn't believe it was real." Something in his expression shifted at that, a flicker of understanding that seemed to reach past the words themselves and land somewhere she hadn't expected anyone to notice. "I understand that more than you know," he said quietly. He didn't explain what he meant. He simply gestured toward the elevators, and for a moment, walking beside him across that vast marble floor, Ivy felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. Not comfort exactly, not yet, but the faint, unfamiliar sense of being somewhere she had been invited rather than merely tolerated. "HR will get you set up with your badge and paperwork," Wade said as they waited for the elevator. "After that, I'll walk you through the design floor myself. I like new people to see where the actual work happens before anyone hands them a spreadsheet." "You do that for everyone?" Ivy asked before she could stop herself. Wade was quiet for a moment. The elevator doors opened and he stepped back to let her enter first. A small gesture, but one that struck her given everything she had read about men in his position. "No," he admitted finally as the doors slid shut and the elevator began its climb. "Not for everyone." He didn't say why. Ivy didn't ask, but something in the honesty of that single word "no" settled into her chest and stayed there quiet and warm, the first stone in a foundation she did not yet know she was starting to build. Neither of them spoke again until the elevator reached the design floor. But as the doors opened onto a bright open room full of workbenches and half-finished boots and the rich familiar smell of good leather, into something almost like recognition, as if somewhere behind his careful composure, he had already begun to understand that the young woman standing beside him carried a weight he knew far more intimately than anyone in that building could have guessed. "Welcome to Sutton Boot and Leather, Ivy," he said quietly. "I have a feeling you're going to do just fine here." She managed a small smile, unsure yet whether to believe him. But as they stepped out onto the floor together into the noise and warmth and quiet dignity of people building something with their own 2 hands, some old exhausted part of her allowed itself just barely to hope that he was right. By mid-morning, the design floor had swallowed Ivy whole in the best possible way. She stood at an unfamiliar workbench watching a craftsman named Earl show her how the tanning room sorted hides by grain and thickness, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, her hands had something useful to do besides count bus fare or fold laundry that wasn't hers. The leather under her fingers was cool and heavy, and there was something almost holy about the quiet concentration of the room needles, moving awls tapping the low murmur of people who took real pride in what they made. She almost forgot for nearly 2 hours to be afraid. Then just before noon, a voice called her name from the doorway, clipped and formal in a way that made the whole rhythm of the room falter. Ivy Malone. My office. Now. Diana Ashford didn't wait to see if she followed. She simply turned and walked away, heels striking the polished floor with the sound of a woman who expected to be obeyed. Ivy set down the length of leather she'd been holding, wiped her palms against her slacks, and followed. Diana's office sat at the far corner of the executive floor, all glass and clean lines. A wall of framed magazine covers behind her desk. Diana at industry galas. Diana shaking hands with senators. Diana standing 2 feet from Wade Sutton, in a photograph that had clearly been cropped from something larger. She didn't offer Ivy a seat. Close the door, Diana said. Ivy closed it, and the noise of the floor behind her went suddenly uncomfortably silent. Let's be honest with each other, Diana said, folding her hands on the desk in front of her. You didn't earn this job. I sat across from you in that interview, and I made the correct professional judgment that you weren't ready for a role at this company. And then less than an hour later, my decision was overturned by a man who has known you for exactly as long as it takes to make a phone call. Mr. Sutton said. I know exactly what Mr. Sutton said. Diana's voice sharpened, the words coming faster, now edged with something Ivy couldn't quite name. Not simple cruelty, but something closer to fear wearing cruelty's clothes. What I want to know is what you said to him. Because women like you don't get handed opportunities like this out of thin air. There's always an angle. There's always a reason. Ivy felt something cold settle low in her stomach, an old familiar sensation, the particular helplessness of being accused of something before she had done anything at all. She had felt it before, more times than she could count. In classrooms where teachers assumed the worst the moment they learned which house she'd come from that year. In waiting rooms where caseworkers looked at her file before they looked at her face. She had spent years building a kind of armor against exactly this feeling, and still standing in this office she felt it slide straight through. I don't have an angle, Ivy said, and was proud distantly that her voice came out steadier than she felt. I applied for a job because I need one, and because I've spent years training to do exactly this kind of work. That's all. That's what they all say. Diana leaned back in her chair, studying Ivy the way a person studies something they've already decided is a threat. You know what I see when I look at you? I see someone with no family behind her. No name that means anything in this city. No safety net, no connections, nothing to lose, which makes you either the hardest working person in this building or the most dangerous one. And I have watched enough people like you circle men like Wade Sutton to know exactly which one I'm betting on. The words landed harder than Ivy expected, harder, because some small wounded part of her had spent her whole life half believing them herself, that having nothing meant she deserved nothing, that the absence of a family name made her somehow suspect somehow less. She had fought that voice for years. Hearing it now spoken aloud by someone with every advantage Ivy had never had, made something in her chest go tight and hot at once. I have never once tried to take advantage of anyone, Ivy said quietly. I grew up with nothing because of circumstances I didn't choose, not because of anything I did. And I would think a woman in your position would understand that having a hard start doesn't make a person dishonest. It just makes them tired. Something flickered across Diana's face. Surprise, maybe, that Ivy hadn't simply wilted. She recovered quickly. Save the speech, Diana said. I've heard versions of it before from people who turned out to want exactly what I thought they wanted. I'm not interested in your story, Miss Malone. I'm interested in results. So let me be very clear about how this is going to work. You will do your job. You will not linger near Mr. Sutton's office. You will not accept personal gifts, personal favors, or personal attention from him, no matter how it's offered. And if I so much as suspect you're using this position for anything other than the work itself, I will make it my personal mission to see you removed from this building. Do we understand each other? Ivy stood very still, her hands clenched at her sides, feeling the old exhausting pull between two instincts. She had spent her whole life balancing the instinct to fight back and the instinct to survive by staying quiet. She chose finally the middle ground she had learned to live in. I understand that you don't trust me, she said. I don't need you to. I just need the chance to prove you wrong. Diana's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. We'll see. You're dismissed, she added, turning back to her monitor as though Ivy had already left the room. Get back to the floor. Ivy walked out, closed the door quietly behind her, and stood for a moment in the hallway, willing her breathing to slow, willing the burn behind her eyes to stay exactly where it was, unshed, unseen, unremarkable to anyone passing by. She had learned that lesson too a long time ago. Crying where people could see it only ever seemed to confirm whatever they'd already decided about her. She made it as far as the stairwell before she finally allowed herself to stop, one hand braced against the cool concrete wall, her heart still hammering from the confrontation. 2 flights below, footsteps echoed faintly, ordinary sounds of an ordinary Monday, utterly indifferent to the fact that something in her chest had just cracked quietly down the middle. You knew this wouldn't be easy, she told herself. You've survived worse than one angry woman with a corner office. It was true. She had survived worse. She had survived nights with no heat, and years with no family, and a childhood spent learning exactly how small she could make herself in a room before anyone noticed she was still hungry. She had survived, and she would survive this too. But survival, she was beginning to understand, was not the same thing as being believed. And some small, tired part of her, the part that had listened to Wade Sutton's voice on the phone 2 nights earlier, and let herself hope just slightly that this place might be different, ached with a disappointment she hadn't expected to feel quite so soon. She straightened her shoulders, wiped her palms once more against her slacks, and climbed back up the stairs toward the design floor, back toward the leather and the needles, and the quiet dignity of work she knew deep down she had every right to be doing. She did not yet know that 3 floors above her in the lobby she would pass through again on her way home that evening. A glass case held a pair of small hand-tooled boots that had been waiting, in a manner of speaking, for 19 years to be recognized. The design floor emptied out slowly at the end of the day, craftsmen setting down tools, wiping benches clean, calling soft goodnights to one another in the unhurried way of people who took genuine pleasure in their work. Ivy stayed later than she needed to, in part because she had nowhere she needed to be, and in part because the quiet of the empty floor felt safer than the walk home through streets that grew less forgiving after dark. By the time she finally gathered her things and made her way toward the elevators, the building had gone hushed in the particular way office towers do after 6 o'clock, footsteps, echoing a little too loudly, lights dimmed to half their daytime brightness. The hum of the air conditioning suddenly audible in a way it never was during business hours. She rode down to the lobby alone, replaying Diana's words from that morning despite every effort not to. No family behind her. No name that means anything. She had heard versions of that sentence her entire life, and still every time it found some old wound and pressed against it freshly, as though her body had never quite learned to expect it. The elevator doors opened onto the lobby, and Ivy stepped out into the wide marble space, empty now, except for a single security guard at the front desk, and the long slanting light of early evening falling gold through the windows. She had walked through this lobby twice already that day, once rushing in, nerves knotted tight in her chest, and once at lunch when she'd been too distracted to notice much of anything around her. Now moving slower, tired in the particular way that came from holding herself together all day, she let her eyes wander, and then she stopped. Along the east wall, tucked into an alcove she hadn't fully registered before, stood a tall glass display case lit softly from within. Ivy almost walked past it, almost let her feet carry her straight to the door and out into the evening air, but something in the shape of what sat inside the case caught at the edge of her vision and refused to let go. She turned back. The case held a single object, a small pair of leather boots no larger than a child's shoe standing upright on a plain wooden pedestal. They were scuffed at the toes in a way that suggested real wear rather than careful staging. The leather, a deep worn brown that had clearly been handled and loved rather than simply displayed. A brass plaque beneath them read in simple engraved letters, "Sutton House, 20 years of quiet." Giving Ivy's breath caught somewhere high in her chest. She stepped closer slowly, the way a person moves towards something they're afraid might vanish if approached too quickly. Her hand rose almost without her permission, fingertips hovering an inch from the glass, tracing the outline of the boots without touching them at all. She knew those boots. She had spent 19 years not knowing what had happened to them, packed away most likely in some box, during one of the countless moves of her childhood, lost. The way everything eventually got lost when a person owned nothing that couldn't fit inside a single bag. But she would have known the shape of that stitching anywhere. The slightly uneven line along the left heel where whoever made them had clearly still been learning. The small, deliberate flower pressed into the leather just above the ankle, a detail no mass-produced boot would ever have bothered, including for a child too poor to care about decoration. She remembered the winter she'd received them. 8 years old, maybe 9 at Sutton House. She remembered the smell of the old building's radiators, the thin donated blankets, the particular ache of a Christmas morning with no family to call her own. And she remembered a boy older than her by several years, quiet and awkward and always slightly too thin, who worked some evenings in the small leather shop, the home kept in its basement, more to give the older boys something useful to do than out of any real expectation of skill. She remembered him kneeling in front of her on that Christmas morning, sliding a pair of boots onto her small, cold feet boots. He had made himself badly in places, beautifully in others, and telling her in a voice that hadn't yet finished, changing, that everybody deserved something that fit them, even if the world outside kept handing them things that didn't. She had never learned his name. He'd left Sutton House not long after, aged out or moved on, she never knew which. She had worn those boots until her feet outgrew them, and then she had kept them anyway, tucked away, moved from house to house to house, until somewhere in the chaos of her 17th year, they had simply disappeared, one more small loss, folded into a childhood, made almost entirely of losses. She stared now at their twins, or perhaps impossibly the very same boots displayed behind glass in the lobby of a billion-dollar company, and felt the floor tilt very slightly beneath her feet. "They're one of a kind," a voice said quietly behind her. Ivy turned so quickly she nearly lost her balance. Wade stood a few feet away, jacket slung over one shoulder, tie loosened clearly on his own way out for the evening. He hadn't meant to startle her. She could see that immediately in the way his expression shifted toward concern. "Sorry," he said. "I didn't mean to sneak up on you." "These boots," Ivy said, and her voice came out thinner than she intended, barely above a whisper. "Where did they come from?" Something in Wade's face went carefully still, the particular stillness of a man guarding something he rarely let anyone near. "They're from a group home the company supports," he said. "Sutton House. We've funded it anonymously for a long time. The boots are just a reminder of why the company exists at all underneath everything else." "Who made them?" Ivy asked. For a long moment Wade didn't answer. He looked at the case instead, at the small, imperfect stitching along the heel, and something passed behind his eyes that Ivy couldn't name. Not quite sorrow, not quite nostalgia. Something older and more complicated than either. "Someone who didn't have much to give," he said finally, except what he could make with his own two hands. Ivy's pulse had climbed into her throat. She thought of the boy in the basement workshop, thin and quiet and careful, kneeling in front of a little girl who had nothing, offering her the one thing he had to offer. She thought of the plaque, 20 years of quiet giving, and did the arithmetic almost without meaning to, counting backward through the years since that Christmas morning, and felt something enormous and unspoken settle into the space between herself and the man standing beside her. "Mr. Sutton," she said carefully. "Did you grow up at Sutton House?" Wade's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. For a moment she thought he might simply deflect the question the way powerful men so often did, redirect it towards something safer, something that didn't require him to open a door he'd clearly kept closed for a very long time. Instead, he turned to look at her fully, and something in his expression, guarded, careful, and underneath all of it, unmistakably afraid, told her more than any answer could have. "That's a longer conversation," he said quietly. "One I don't think either of us is ready for tonight." He didn't confirm it. He didn't need to. Ivy looked back at the small scuffed boots behind the glass, at the uneven stitching she had traced with her own small fingers a lifetime ago, and felt the ground of everything she thought she understood about this place, and about the man standing beside her, shift quietly and irrevocably beneath her feet. "Good night," Ivy, Wade said softly, and there was something almost pleading in it, a request for gentleness he didn't quite know how to ask for directly. "Good night, Mr. Sutton," she answered. But long after he had gone, she stood alone in the darkening lobby, staring at a pair of boots that had once been the only kindness in an entire childhood, and understood with a certainty that settled deep into her bones that her life and Wade Sutton's had been quietly, invisibly tangled together, for far longer than either of them had known. The next morning the design floor buzzed with its usual quiet industry, the hiss of steam presses, the rhythmic tap of hammers setting eyelets, the low murmur of craftsmen comparing notes over a difficult seam. Ivy arrived early, earlier than she needed to, in part because she hadn't slept much and in part because the workshop had become, in just a few short days, the one place in the building where she felt something like solid ground beneath her. She hadn't stopped thinking about the boots. She had lain awake most of the night, turning the memory over and over, the boy in the basement workshop, the uneven stitching, the plaque that read 20 years of quiet giving. She told herself more than once that she might be wrong. Boots were boots. Leather could be shaped 1,000 ways by 1,000 different hands, and grief and hope had a way of finding patterns in things that were really only coincidence. but some deep, quiet certainty in her chest refused to be talked down, and she carried it with her all morning like a stone tucked into her pocket, present in every movement even when she wasn't consciously thinking of it. She was bent over a workbench just after 10 o'clock, carefully skiving the edge of a scrap of leather, the way Earl had shown her, when the noise of the floor shifted, not loud but different, a ripple of attention moving from bench to bench the way it did whenever someone important walked in. She looked up and found Wade Sutton crossing the floor directly toward her, a flat box tucked under one arm and behind him at a respectful distance. Half the design floor had gone quiet in that particular way. People go quiet when they sense they're about to witness something worth repeating. Later at lunch, Mr. Sutton, Ivy said, straightening quickly, wiping her hands against her apron. Is something wrong? Nothing's wrong. He stopped in front of her workbench, and for a moment something almost boyish crossed his face, an awkwardness that looked strange on a man who otherwise carried himself with such careful composure. I wanted to give you something. Before I lose my nerve. He set the box down on the workbench and opened the lid. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, sat a pair of boots, not small, not a child's size this time, but a woman's pair made of the same deep, honest brown leather as the ones behind the glass downstairs, stitched with the same small flower, pressed just above the ankle. Ivy stared at them, and for a long moment she couldn't make herself speak at all. I made these myself, Wade said quietly last night. I haven't made a pair of boots with my own hands in a long time. Not since before the company got big enough that other people did it for me. But after last night I thought. He stopped, exhaled, started again. I thought you should have a pair that were made for you. Not one you had to remember from somewhere else. Around them the floor had gone entirely silent. Every craftsman within earshot had stopped what they were doing, tools resting mid-motion, eyes moving carefully between Ivy and Wade, with the particular hunger of people who understood they were watching something that would be the entire subject of every lunch break for the next month. Ivy reached out with trembling fingers and touched the leather, tracing the small flower stitched above the ankle, and felt her throat close around a sob. She refused to let escape in front of an audience. You didn't have to do this, she whispered. I know, Wade said. I wanted to. He held her gaze for a moment longer than either of them was probably prepared for, something unspoken passing between them. Not quite a confession, not quite a promise, but the fragile beginning of both. Then, as if suddenly remembering they were standing in the middle of a crowded workroom, he straightened, cleared his throat, and took half a step back. I hope they fit, he said in a voice that had gone deliberately lighter, deliberately more casual, a man retreating behind professionalism the way he clearly knew how to do when emotion threatened to spill past its careful banks. If they don't, Earl can adjust them. He's better at fittings than I ever was. They'll fit, Ivy said softly. I know they will. Wade nodded, once gave the room a brief, almost apologetic glance, and turned to walk back toward the elevators, leaving behind him a silence that lasted for several full seconds before the floor slowly, carefully exploded into whispers. By the time Ivy sat down for lunch in the small break room on the design floor, the story had already traveled twice around the building, gaining detail with each retelling the way stories in offices always did. She caught fragments of it drifting past her table. He made them himself. Can you believe that? And I've never seen him do anything like that for anyone. And more than once, a lowered voice adding, I heard his mother's not going like this one bit. She ate quietly alone, trying not to listen and mostly failing. She was halfway through her sandwich when a broad-shouldered man in a company polo sat down across from her without asking, setting a tray down with more force than necessary. His expression was not unkind exactly, but it was unmistakably wary, the look of a man sizing up a stranger he had already decided he didn't trust. Roy Callahan, he said. Everybody calls me Cal. I run security for the building. Ivy Malone, she said carefully. I know who you are. Cal studied her for a long moment, arms folded, something guarded behind his eyes. Whole floor's talking about the boots. It wasn't my idea, Ivy said. I didn't ask him to. I didn't say you did. Cal's voice was even, but there was an edge underneath it, the edge of a man who had clearly rehearsed this conversation in his head before deciding to have it. I've known Wade since we were kids, running around the same 3 blocks with holes in our shoes. I've watched a lot of people try to get close to him over the years once he had something worth being close to. Money changes what people are willing to say to get near it. I'm not trying to get near his money, Ivy said quietly. Maybe not, Cal said. But I've heard that before too. He leaned back slightly, his gaze unreadable. I'm not saying you're lying. I'm saying I watched him make those boots by hand last night instead of sleeping, and I haven't seen him do something like that in more years than I can count. So whatever's going on with you, whatever this is, I'm going to be watching. Closely. He stood, picked up his tray, and left without waiting for a response, leaving Ivy alone at the small table with half a sandwich and a growing uneasy weight settling into her chest. She thought of the boy in the basement workshop kneeling in front of a little girl with cold feet. She thought of the man he had become, careful, guarded, quietly generous in a way that seemed designed to go unnoticed. And she thought with a small aching clarity that whatever history lived behind Wade Sutton's composed exterior, it clearly ran far deeper and far more painfully than anyone in that building, perhaps including Wade himself, had yet allowed themselves to say out loud. The workday ended later than Ivy intended, the design floor emptying out slowly around her, while she finished labeling a tray of finished samples for the following morning's shipment. By the time she stepped out through the loading dock doors into the parking area, the sky had gone the deep blue-orange of early evening streetlights just beginning to flicker on along the row of company trucks parked for the night. She hadn't expected to see Wade there, leaning against the driver's side of a plain, unremarkable pickup truck that looked nothing like what she imagined a billionaire would drive. No sleek black sedan, no driver waiting behind tinted glass. Just Wade Sutton, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbow, keys turning idly in one hand. "Long day," he said by way of greeting. "You're still here," Ivy said, surprised. "I was waiting for you, actually." He straightened, and there was that same faint awkwardness from that morning. The boyishness that seemed to surface only in moments like this, away from the polish of boardrooms and the watching eyes of the design floor. "It's dark out, and the bus stop near your place isn't exactly well lit this time of year. I thought I'd drive you home if that's all right." Ivy hesitated. Diana's warning from 2 days earlier surfaced immediately in her mind. You will not accept personal gifts, personal favors, or personal attention from him. And beneath that warning, an older, more exhausted instinct that had learned over many years to be suspicious of kindness that came too easily. But she was tired, and the walk to the bus stop really was long, and something in Wade's face, careful and a little uncertain, didn't match the picture Diana had painted of a man who took whatever he wanted without a second thought. "Okay," she said finally. "Thank you." The truck's interior was worn in a way that surprised her. Cracked leather on the driver's seat, a faded fabric air freshener shaped like a boot hanging from the rearview mirror, a coffee cup ring on the console that no one had ever bothered to wipe away. It looked more than anything like the truck of a man who had owned it for a very long time and never once considered replacing it, simply because he could afford something newer. "Not what you expected?" Wade asked, catching her expression as he pulled out of the lot. "No," Ivy admitted. "I guess I thought." "Everybody thinks that," he said, a small, tired smile tugging at one corner of his mouth. "I bought this truck the year the company finally turned a real profit. Told myself I'd trade it in once I got used to having money. Never did. Guess some habits don't leave just because your bank account changes." They drove in comfortable silence for a while, streetlights sliding past the windows, the city settling into its evening rhythm around them. Ivy found herself watching him without meaning, to the careful way he held the wheel, the small tension in his jaw that never quite seemed to fully release, even now, even away from the office. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. "Depends what it is." "The boot's downstairs. Sutton House." She chose her words carefully, aware she was walking towards something fragile. "You said it was a longer conversation. I don't want to push, but I think I might have grown up there too." Wade's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the wheel. For a long moment he didn't answer, and Ivy began to wonder if she'd made a mistake, if she'd pushed too far too fast into a door he'd made clear he wasn't ready to open. "I know," he said finally, quietly. Ivy turned to look at him fully. "You know, I recognized your name the moment I saw your application," Wade said. "Ivy Malone. There aren't that many kids who passed through that house over the years whose names I remember, but yours I remembered." He exhaled slowly, eyes fixed on the road ahead as though it were easier to say the rest of it without looking at her. "I was 17 when I aged out. You would have been, what, 8, 9? 8, Ivy said softly. That Christmas, he echoed. The truck rolled to a stop at a red light, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them, thick with everything neither one of them had said yet. "I used to work in that basement shop most evenings," Wade said finally. "Nobody expected much to come of it. Half the time I was down there because it was warmer than the dormitory, if I'm honest. But there was something about working with my hands that made the rest of it, the noise, the waiting, the not knowing where you'd end up next, quieter for a while." "You made those boots for me," Ivy said. "It wasn't a question anymore." "I made a lot of things for a lot of kids," Wade said. "Most of them I don't remember clearly anymore. But I remember you. Small for your age. Quiet in a way that worried the staff, I think, though nobody ever said so out loud. You used to sit near the workshop door sometimes, just watching, never asking for anything. He glanced at her briefly, something raw and unguarded flickering across his face before he turned back to the road. I remember thinking you looked cold all the time, even inside. Ivy's eyes stung, and this time she didn't fight it as hard as she usually did. I was, she said. I don't think I stopped being cold until I put those boots on. Wade said nothing for a long moment. The light turned green and the truck moved forward again, slower now, as though some part of him wanted to draw the drive out a little longer than it needed to be. I never knew what happened to you after I left, he said finally. I used to wonder sometimes whether you'd ended up somewhere decent, whether anybody ever looked out for you the way nobody really looked out for me before I learned to look out for myself. He paused. Finding your application on my desk a few weeks ago, I don't know how to explain what that felt like. Like something coming back around after a very long time. They pulled up outside the laundromat, the truck idling at the curb, neither of them making any move to end the moment just yet. Thank you, Ivy said quietly, for the boots. Both pairs, 19 years apart. Something in Wade's expression cracked open just slightly, not quite a smile, something gentler and sadder than that. You're welcome, he said. I meant it the same way both times. Everybody deserves something that fits them, even when the world keeps handing them things that don't. Ivy reached for the door handle, then paused. Can I ask one more thing? You can ask. Is that why you fund the house? Because of what it was like for you there. Wade was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working slightly, some old weight visibly settling over him. Part of it, he said finally in a voice that had gone noticeably rougher than before. There's more to it than that. But it's not. I'm not ready to tell that part tonight. Ivy nodded, understanding in the particular way. Only someone who had also learned to carry things quietly could understand that some doors needed to stay closed until the person holding them was ready to open them on their own terms. Good night, Wade, she said softly, using his first name for the first time. Something in his face shifted at the sound of it, surprised, and beneath the surprise, something warmer. Good night, Ivy. She climbed out and watched the truck pull away into the darkening street, and stood for a long moment on the sidewalk outside her building, one hand pressed briefly against her chest, trying to hold on to the strange, fragile warmth of an evening that had begun as an ordinary drive home, and had somehow become something else entirely. She did not see in the truck's side mirror as it pulled away Wade's hands tightened briefly on the wheel, or the way his eyes glistened for just a moment before he blinked it back and forced himself to focus on the road ahead, carrying, as he always did, the parts of his past he had not yet found the courage to say out loud. The weeks that followed settled into something Ivy hadn't dared to hope for: a rhythm. Mornings on the design floor with Earl and the other craftsmen who had begun slowly to treat her like one of their own, rather than a curiosity to be watched. Afternoons that occasionally included a passing visit from Wade, brief and professional in front of others, but carrying underneath the surface the quiet weight of everything neither of them had said yet. And evenings, more often than not, that ended with his truck waiting at the curb outside the loading dock. An unspoken arrangement neither of them had ever formally made. It was on one of those evenings nearly 3 weeks after the boots that everything changed. They had driven for a while in their usual comfortable quiet, the radio turned low, the city sliding past the windows in its familiar amber light. But instead of turning toward the laundromat, Wade had taken a different route, winding out past the edge of the stockyards toward a stretch of road Ivy didn't recognize. Where are we going? She asked. Somewhere I haven't taken anyone in a long time, Wade said, and something in his voice, quieter than usual, almost unsteady, told her not to ask more. The truck eventually slowed in front of a small, well-kept cemetery on the outskirts of the city iron gates, standing open in the fading light rows of modest headstones stretching back toward a line of old oak trees. Wade parked, sat for a moment with both hands still on the wheel, and then finally turned off the engine. I need to tell you something, he said, and I need you to let me get through all of it before you say anything. I don't think I'll manage it otherwise. Ivy nodded, her chest already tightening with the particular ache of knowing someone was about to hand her something fragile. They walked together across the quiet grass, Wade's steps slowing as they approached a small headstone near the back row, simpler than most of the others, weathered by years of Texas summers. Ivy read the name carved into it and felt her breath catch. Hannah Sutton, beloved sister. 11 years gone too soon. My sister, Wade said, his voice low and rough, the careful composure he wore like armor, everywhere else finally visibly cracking. 2 years younger than me. We came to Sutton House together after our mother couldn't keep us anymore. She got sick that first winter. I keep telling myself it wasn't anybody's fault, exactly, the flu, then pneumonia on top of it, moving fast the way it does in a body that's already too thin. But the truth is, The home didn't have the money that year to get her to a hospital in time. There was a wait list for the county clinic. There was a form that took 3 days to process. There was a director who tried, "I believe that I really do," but there wasn't enough, and by the time there was, it was already too late. Ivy stood very still, her hand pressed against her mouth, tears already sliding silently down her face. "I was 15, Wade continued, staring at the headstone rather than at her, as though it were easier to say the rest of it to a piece of stone than to a living person. "I sat in that hallway outside the infirmary for 2 days straight, and I remember thinking over and over that if I'd had money, if I'd had anything at all to trade for a faster ambulance, a better doctor, a bed in a real hospital, instead of a cot in a basement clinic, she would still be alive. I made myself a promise after that. I don't think I even said it out loud, not for years. But I promised her, standing right about where you're standing now, that I would never again stand somewhere helpless while a child I loved died, because the world decided her life wasn't worth moving fast for." Wade Ivy's voice broke on his name. "Let me finish," he said gently, and she nodded, pressing her lips together. "I worked every job I could find after that. Slept in shelters, sometimes in my car once I finally had one that ran. Learned leather work because it was the one thing Sutton House had ever given me that felt like it was mine, a skill, a trade, something nobody could take away from me the way they'd taken everything else. I built this company one boot at a time, Ivy, out of nothing, out of grief mostly. And the first real profit this company ever made, I put straight back into Sutton House. Not because anybody asked me to. Because I couldn't stand the thought of another kid sitting in a hallway the way I did, waiting for help that came too late." He finally turned to look at her, and Ivy saw for the first time since she'd met him a man with no defenses left at all. Just grief, worn soft and heavy from 20 years of carrying it mostly alone. "The boots," he said. "The ones I made for you both times. I think some part of me has spent 19 years trying to give every child at that house the thing I couldn't give Hannah. Something that fit. Something that said somebody noticed you, somebody cared whether you were cold, even when the whole rest of the world seemed too busy to look." Ivy closed the distance between them without thinking, wrapping her arms around him, and felt him go rigid for a moment. The reflex of a man unused to being held rather than simply admired from a careful distance, before slowly he let himself lean into it, his shoulders shaking once, twice, with the effort of holding back tears he had clearly been holding back for a very long time. "I'm so sorry," Ivy whispered against his shoulder. "I'm so sorry you carried that alone. I didn't want anyone to see it." Wade admitted, his voice muffled and unsteady. "Guilt like that, it doesn't exactly inspire confidence in a business partner. Doesn't exactly fit on a magazine cover next to a headline about self-made success. Easier to just be the man who builds boots and writes checks nobody sees and let people believe whatever story about me makes the most sense to them." "I don't need a story that makes sense," Ivy said softly, pulling back just enough to look at him. "I need the truth. And the truth is, you turned the worst thing that ever happened to you into something that's kept kids like me warm for 20 years. That's not something to hide, Wade. That's something to be proud of." Wade searched her face for a long moment, something unguarded and disbelieving in his expression, as though he had spent so many years bracing for people to recoil from the weight of his grief that he had genuinely never considered someone might simply stay. "I've never told anyone all of that," he said quietly. "Not Cal. Not my mother, not the whole of it. Just pieces over the years, whatever seemed manageable at the time." "Why me?" Ivy asked. Wade looked back at the small headstone, then at her, and something in his face settled into a kind of quiet certainty. "Because I think Hannah would have liked you," he said. "And because some part of me has known since the moment I saw your name on that application that whatever this is between us, it isn't an accident. It's something closer to a debt I never got to pay, her being handed back to me 20 years late in the shape of someone who actually survived." They stood together in the fading light a long while, the cemetery settling into the particular hush of early evening, and Ivy understood with a clarity that felt almost sacred that she had just been trusted with the truest, most guarded part of a man the rest of the world only ever saw as untouchable. "Thank you for telling me," she said finally. "Thank you for staying," Wade answered, long enough to hear it. Nearly 2 weeks passed after that evening at the cemetery, and something had shifted quietly between Wade and Ivy. Not dramatic, not announced to the rest of the building, but unmistakable to anyone who paid close attention. He found reasons to walk the design floor a little more often. She found herself more than once glancing toward the elevators a few minutes before the end of the day, waiting for the particular sound of his footsteps. Neither of them had said the word that belonged to what was growing between them. But it lived there anyway, quiet and steady in the space they had built out of grief, shared, and finally spoken aloud. It was a Thursday afternoon, warm for the season, when Margaret Sutton arrived at the building unannounced. Ivy was on the executive floor delivering a set of finished samples when she saw her for the first time, a tall, elegant woman in her 60s, silver hair swept back in a style that had clearly cost more than Ivy's monthly rent, moving through the office with the particular confidence of someone who had never once in her entire life doubted she belonged wherever she happened to be standing. "Where is my son?" Margaret said to the receptionist, not quite a question. "In his office, Mrs. Sutton, but he has a call in about 10 minutes, so if you'd like to." "He'll make time," Margaret said, already walking past her. Ivy stepped quickly out of the way. As Margaret swept by, catching in the brief second, their eyes met a look of appraisal so swift and so thorough that it left her feeling absurdly as though she'd been measured and filed away before she'd had the chance to say a single word. She didn't think much more of it until 20 minutes later, passing back through the corridor with an empty sample tray, she heard raised voices through the partially closed door of Wade's office. "You cannot be serious," Margaret was saying, her voice sharp and clipped in a way that carried easily through the gap in the door. "Wade, I raised you better than this. I did not spend 30 years building this family's name so you could throw it away on some girl with no history, no education, no family to speak of. Mom, don't mom me. I have heard the talk, Wade. The whole city has heard the talk. Custom boots delivered by hand on the design floor, driving her home yourself like some teenager with his first crush. Do you have any idea how that looks? Do you have any idea what people are already saying about the state of your judgment?" Ivy stopped in the corridor, tray still in her hands, unable to make herself walk away. "I don't particularly care what people are saying," Wade said, his voice controlled but firm. "You should care," Margaret snapped. "You are not just a man anymore, Wade. You are the company. Every decision you make reflects on everything your father and I built, everything I have sacrificed to protect since he died. And I have made my peace over the years with the idea that you might eventually settle down with someone appropriate. Diana, for instance, level-headed, from a good family, someone who understands what it means to run in these circles. Not some girl who grew up bouncing between foster placements with nothing to her name. That girl," Wade said, and something in his voice had gone very cold, "has more integrity than most of the people you've ever introduced me to at one of your galas. Integrity doesn't build alliances, Wade. Integrity doesn't protect this family's reputation." "And what exactly is this family's reputation built on, Mom?" Wade's voice had risen, now sharp with something Ivy hadn't heard from him before. "Because from where I'm standing, it's built on the same thing. I built this whole company on starting with nothing, and refusing to let anybody tell me nothing was all I deserved." There was a long silence. "I already know about her background," Margaret said, finally, her voice lower now, more deliberate. "I had someone look into it the moment I heard the rumors. Foster care. No known parents. A group home on the east side that frankly I'm surprised you'd want anyone reminded you have any connection to at all." Ivy's stomach dropped. "You had someone investigate her," Wade said slowly, each word landing like a stone. "I protect this family, Wade. I have always protected this family. And I will not stand by and watch you hand our name, our company, everything your father and I built to a woman who has nothing to offer this family except a sad story and a pretty face." "Get out," Wade said. "Excuse me. You heard me." His voice had dropped into something quiet and dangerous, a stillness Ivy hadn't yet witnessed from him. "I have listened to you talk about people's worth in terms of their bank accounts and their last names for my entire life. Mom and I have bitten my tongue more times than I can count because you're my mother and I love you. But I will not sit here and listen to you talk about Ivy that way. Not in my office. Not anywhere." "You're choosing her," Margaret said, and something in her voice had cracked just slightly beneath the anger. Something that sounded for one unguarded moment almost like grief. "Over your own family. I'm choosing decency," Wade said. "If that's the same thing as choosing against you, that's not a distance I put between us, Mom. That's one you built a long time ago." Ivy heard the sharp click of heels against the floor, and had only a second to step back into a doorway before Margaret emerged from Wade's office. Her face flushed, her composure visibly rattled for the first time since she'd arrived. Their eyes met for one brief, charged moment in the hallway. "You have no idea what you're walking into," Margaret said quietly, not unkindly, exactly, but with a weight that suggested it wasn't entirely a threat either, almost strangely, a warning. "This family carries more than my son has ever told you, I'm sure. Be careful how much of yourself you hand over before you understand all of it." She was gone before Ivy could find any words to answer. Ivy stood alone in the corridor for a long moment, her heart still hammering, turning Margaret's last words over in her mind. She thought of the cemetery, of Hannah's headstone, of the raw, unguarded grief Wade had finally allowed her to see. She wondered with a slow, uneasy dread exactly how much more there was to carry. Down the hall near the security office, Cal Callahan stood half hidden by the corner of the wall, having clearly overheard at least the tail end of the confrontation. His eyes met Ivy's briefly across the distance, unreadable, guarded, calculating in a way that made her stomach tighten all over again. He didn't say anything. He simply turned and walked away already. It seemed deciding what he intended to do next. Wade found her 20 minutes later standing near the loading dock with the empty sample tray still clutched against her chest, staring out at the parking lot without really seeing it. He didn't say anything at first. He simply came to stand beside her close enough that she could feel the tension still radiating off him from the confrontation upstairs. "You heard," he said finally. "Not a question." "Most of it," Ivy admitted. "I wasn't trying to. I just couldn't make myself walk away." Wade exhaled, slowly running a hand through his hair, the gesture of a man trying to steady himself after a storm that hadn't quite finished passing. "I'm sorry you had to hear my mother talk about you like that. You didn't deserve any of it." "She's not wrong that I have no family name," Ivy said quietly. "No history anyone would put in a magazine. She's wrong about everything that matters," Wade said, turning to face her fully. "I meant what I said in there, Ivy. Every word of it. I'm not interested in a life built around what looks respectable to people who've never once had to wonder where their next meal was coming from. I built this company out of grief and hunger and nothing else, and if that's not good enough for the family name, then the family name can find someone else to carry it." "She had someone investigate me," Ivy said, and her voice trembled slightly despite her best efforts to keep it steady. "Wade, what does she even know? What did she find?" "I don't know," Wade admitted, "and I don't care. Whatever she thinks she's uncovered, it doesn't change a single thing about how I feel about you." Ivy studied his face for a long moment, searching for any flicker of doubt, and found none, only the same steady, unguarded certainty she'd seen at the cemetery 2 weeks earlier. The look of a man who had already decided somewhere deep down that he would rather lose everything his name was supposed to protect than lose the one thing that had actually made him feel like more than the sum of his grief. "She said you'd never marry anyone but Diana," Ivy said. "That she's already made her peace with that." Something hardened in Wade's expression. "My mother has spent 30 years deciding who I'm supposed to be. She decided a long time ago that Diana made sense, good family, right connections, the kind of alliance she thinks protects everything my father built. I let her believe it for years because it was easier than fighting her on something I didn't care enough about to fight for." He reached out gently and took Ivy's hand in both of his. "I care about this. I'm not backing down from it. Not for her, not for the company's reputation, not for anything." Ivy felt something in her chest loosen just slightly, even as a quieter unease continued to sit beneath it. Margaret's parting words still echoing in her mind. "You have no idea what you're walking into. This family carries more than my son has ever told you." "There's something else," Wade said, as though reading the thought directly off her face. "Something my mother's never said to me directly, but that I've suspected for a long time. I think she carries guilt about my father's death that she's never once admitted to anyone. And I think some part of the way she controls everything who I marry, how the company looks, what story gets told about this family comes from trying to make up for something she's never let herself name out loud." "What happened to your father?" Ivy asked gently. Wade's jaw tightened. "Business deal gone bad, the official story goes. Heart attack a year later, stress-related, the doctors said. I was 17. I never fully understood the details. My mother handled all of it, kept it close, wouldn't talk about it even years later. All I know is the company nearly went under before I dragged it back from nothing, and my mother has spent every year since making absolutely certain nothing like that ever happens again. Even if it means controlling every part of my life she can get her hands on." Ivy said nothing, but she filed the words away carefully, sensing with the same instinct that had once taught her to read a room full of strangers, deciding her fate that there was more beneath the surface of that story than either of them yet understood. Cal was waiting for Wade in his office when he returned upstairs, standing near the window with his arms crossed, his expression carrying the particular grimness of a man who had made up his mind about something and intended to say so, whether or not it was welcome. "We need to talk," Cal said before Wade had even closed the door. "If this is about my mother, it's about Ivy." Cal's voice was flat, careful, the tone of a man choosing his words with more restraint than he actually felt. "I heard some of what happened up here today, and I'm not going to pretend I'm not worried, Wade, because I am. You made those boots for her. You're taking her to the cemetery, for God's sake, a place you haven't let me near in 10 years. Something's moving fast here, and I don't think you're seeing it clearly." "I see it perfectly clearly," Wade said. "Do you?" Cal stepped closer, his frustration finally breaking through the careful control he usually kept over his voice. Because I've watched you build this company from a card table in a rented storage unit, Wade. I've watched people circle you the second they figured out what you were worth, women investors, so-called friends who disappeared the moment you couldn't do anything for them anymore. I am not going to stand here and watch it happen again without saying something. Ivy isn't like that. Maybe not, Cal said. But I've known you since we were 9 years old, sharing a bag of chips because neither of us had enough for our own. I owe it to you and to Hannah's memory, since we're apparently telling that story to new people now, to make sure I'm right about that before you hand this woman your whole heart. Wade's expression flickered at the mention of his sister's name, something raw passing briefly across his features before he forced it back down. What are you saying, Cal? I'm saying I'm going to look into her, Cal said. Quietly, thoroughly. Not because I want to be right about her. Wade, believe me, some part of me hopes I'm not. But because somebody in your life needs to ask the hard questions when you're too far gone to ask them yourself. And right now, that's me. Wade was quiet for a long moment, torn between the instinct to defend Ivy outright and the older, deeper knowledge that Cal's loyalty, however misdirected it might turn out to be, had never once in 20 years steered him wrong. Fine, he said, finally, low and reluctant. Look, but when you don't find anything, Cal, and you won't, I need you to be as loud about being wrong as you are right now about being cautious. Deal, Cal said. He left without another word, already pulling his phone from his pocket, his mind already moving toward the first calls he intended to make, never once suspecting that the investigation he was about to launch meant to protect his best friend from being used, was about to unearth something far more dangerous than anything he'd imagined, hiding not in Ivy Malone's past at all, but in the closest circle around Wade himself. Cal Callahan had built his career on trusting his own instincts, and for the better part of a week those instincts told him he was about to catch Ivy Malone in exactly the kind of quiet, patient deception he'd spent years watching wealthy men fall for. He started where he always started: public records, old addresses, employment history, expecting at every turn to find the cracks in her story that would justify the unease sitting in his chest since the day Wade brought those boots down to the design floor. He found no cracks. What he found instead spread across 3 foster placements and a group home record thin with the particular sparseness of a childhood no one had bothered to document carefully, was a young woman who had aged out of the system at 18 with nothing but a duffel bag and a high school diploma, and who had spent every year since working 2 jobs at a time to put herself through a leatherworking certification program most people in her position would never have known existed. He found tucked into a small local newspaper archive from 2 winters earlier a short article about an anonymous donor who had walked into a downtown clinic and quietly paid off the overdue hospital bill of a stranger, an elderly man who'd been turned away from a pharmacy for a medication he couldn't afford. The clinic had never released the donor's name. Cal, working off nothing but a hunch and an old habit of cross-referencing dates, matched the timing to a 2-week gap in Ivy's own modest bank statements, obtained through a contact he wasn't entirely proud of using, and understood, with a slow, uncomfortable sinking feeling, exactly whose money it had been. She'd given away nearly everything she had quietly to a stranger who would never know her name. Cal sat with that discovery for a long time, turning it over, waiting for the cynical part of himself to find an angle, a hidden motive, some version of the story that made her generosity make sense as manipulation rather than simple decency. He didn't find one. He found instead an uncomfortable and unfamiliar feeling settling into his chest, something close to shame. But it was the second thread of his investigation that changed everything. It began almost by accident, cross-referencing Ivy's original rejected application against the company's hiring records, hoping to understand exactly how Diana had justified turning her away. Cal noticed a discrepancy buried in the file's metadata document that had been edited twice on the same afternoon. Hours apart, the second edit made from a login credential that didn't belong to Diana at all. It belonged to Margaret Sutton's personal assistant. Cal stared at the screen for a long moment, his stomach tightening with a dread that had nothing to do with Ivy anymore. He pulled the thread further, quietly, carefully, using the same access privileges that had let him move through 20 years of the company's back rooms without anyone questioning why the head of security needed to see what he needed to see. What he found took 3 more days to fully piece together, and by the end of it his hands were shaking as he printed the final set of documents. A series of financial transfers routed through a shell account, with Diana Ashford's name buried 3 layers deep in its paperwork, designed to make it appear on paper that Ivy had accessed, and diverted a modest sum from a supplier account during her first 2 weeks of employment, A fabricated trail carefully backdated, clearly built to be discovered at exactly the right moment to destroy her credibility and force her resignation before anyone could ask too many questions about why. And beneath that older buried deeper, something Cal hadn't been looking for at all. A set of files from nearly 20 years earlier correspondence between Margaret Sutton and a business partner regarding a deal that had, according to every official account Wade had ever been given, simply gone bad. The emails told a different story. They showed Margaret, then newly responsible for the family's finances, while her husband recovered from an earlier illness, pushing hard for an investment her husband had explicitly warned against, overruling his objections in a series of increasingly sharp exchanges, and ultimately signing off on the deal herself, using a limited power of attorney she had by the wording of one particularly damning email quietly extended without formally notifying him. The deal collapsed within the year. The stress of the fallout, according to a final letter from a family physician Cal found scanned into an old insurance file, had been listed as a significant contributing factor in the cardiac event that killed Robert Sutton 11 months later. Margaret Sutton had never told her son the truth. She had let him believe for 20 years that his father's death and the company's near collapse were simply the cruelty of circumstance, bad luck, bad timing, nothing anyone could have prevented. She had built her entire relationship with Wade. Cal now understood with a slow, sick clarity on a foundation of guilt. She had never once allowed herself to name, channeling it instead into control over the company, over Wade's choices, over exactly who was and wasn't permitted to get close to him. And now, faced with the possibility of losing that control entirely to a woman with no name and no fortune, she had allowed, or worse, orchestrated a scheme to frame that same woman for theft. Cal sat alone in his small office late into the evening, the printed documents spread across his desk, and felt for the first time in longer than he could remember genuinely unsure of what to do next. He thought of Wade at 17, standing in a hospital hallway, believing his father's death had simply been misfortune. He thought of Wade at the cemetery telling Ivy about Hannah carrying a grief he'd spent 20 years believing was the only debt this family owed the world. He thought of Ivy quietly walking into a downtown clinic to pay a stranger's hospital bill with money she could not afford to give away, asking for nothing in return, not even a name. And he thought of himself 3 weeks ago sitting across from her at lunch, warning her that he'd be watching closely, never once imagining that what he'd eventually find would implicate not the woman he'd doubted but the family he'd spent his whole life protecting. He gathered the documents, carefully squared the edges of the stack, with hands that hadn't quite stopped trembling, and picked up his phone. Wade answered on the second ring, his voice easy, unsuspecting. "Cal, everything okay?" Cal closed his eyes for a moment before answering, bracing himself for the conversation that was about to unravel everything his best friend believed about his own family. "No," he said quietly. "I need you to come to my office. Now. And Wade, I need you to sit down before I show you what I found." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "You were wrong about her," Wade said finally, something cautious and hopeful threading through the words. "I was wrong about a lot of things," Cal said, "but not about her being in danger. Wade, it's worse than either of us thought, and it's not coming from where either of us expected." He ended the call, squared the documents one final time, and sat waiting in the quiet of his office, dreading more than he had dreaded almost anything in 20 years of friendship, the look that was about to cross his best friend's face when he finally learned the truth about the family that had raised him. Wade read through the documents twice, standing at Cal's desk with his jacket still half on one shoulder, never quite finding its way into the sleeve. He read the emails between his mother and her old business partner in silence, his face draining of color line by line, and when he reached the letter from the family physician, the one that connected the stress of the collapsed deal to his father's heart, 11 months later he set the papers, files down very carefully, as though they might shatter, and simply stood there for a long moment without speaking at all. "She let me believe it was bad luck," he said, finally, his voice hollowed out. 20 years, Cal. 20 years of watching her mourn him right alongside me, and the whole time I know," Cal said quietly. "And the theft charges against Ivy. The transfers. That's Wade." Pressed both hands flat against the desk, steadying himself. "That's her too. That's my mother. It's Diana's name on the Shell account," Cal said carefully, "but the access trail goes back to your mother's assistant. I don't think Diana acted alone on this one, Wade. I think they're in it together." Wade closed his eyes. For a moment, Cal thought he might simply come apart right there in the small, cluttered office, 20 years of grief and guilt, and carefully managed control finally colliding all at once. Instead, when Wade opened his eyes again, something in his face had hardened into a kind of quiet, focused resolve that Cal recognized instantly because he'd seen it only once before. The year Wade had rebuilt an entire company out of a single rented storage unit rather than let it die along with his father. "We need to move fast," Wade said. "Whatever they're planning to do with this fabricated theft trail, it's not going to sit quietly in a drawer. If they've built it to be found, they've built it to be used." He was right. The call came the next morning, less than an hour after Ivy had clocked in. Two uniformed officers arrived at the loading dock entrance shortly after 9, flanked by a company attorney Ivy had never seen before, and Diana Ashford, whose expression carried a carefully constructed mask of regret that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Ivy Malone," one of the officers said, stepping forward, as the design floor slowly went silent around them. Tools setting down one by one, every eye in the room swinging toward the small, unfolding scene near the entrance. "We need you to come with us. There's been a report of unauthorized fund transfers traced to your employee credentials." Ivy stared at him, uncomprehending for a moment, the words arriving too fast and too strange to fully land. There must be some mistake. I've never touched a supplier account. I don't even have access to." "The records say otherwise," Diana said smoothly, stepping forward with a manila folder clutched against her chest like evidence of her own reluctant duty. "I tried to give you every benefit of the doubt, Miss Malone. I really did. But the numbers don't lie." Earl stepped forward from his workbench, his weathered face creased with alarm. "This is a mistake. This girl's been nothing but honest since the day she walked in here." "Sir, please step back," the second officer said. Ivy felt the room tilt around her, the particular dizzying horror of a nightmare arriving in broad daylight in front of people who had only just begun to trust her. She thought absurdly of every caseworker who had ever looked at her file before looking at her face, every teacher who had assumed the worst the moment they learned which house she'd come from that year, and understood with a sinking certainty that some part of her had always known a moment like this was waiting for her. No matter how hard she worked, no matter how carefully she tried to build a life that couldn't be taken away. "Please," she said, her voice cracking, "I haven't done anything. I need to call. You can make your calls downtown," the first officer said, not unkindly but firmly, already reaching for her arm. The cold click of the handcuffs closing around her wrists was a sound Ivy would remember for the rest of her life. Sharp, metallic, final, echoing through a design floor, gone utterly silent, except for the low hum of overhead lights and somewhere behind her. Earl's furious, helpless protest cut short by the attorney's raised hand. She was led past workbenches she had come to think of in just a few short weeks as the first real home she'd ever had, past craftsmen who stared at her with expressions somewhere between shock and pity, past the wide windows overlooking the stockyard's gold morning light falling across a scene that felt suddenly like it belonged to someone else's life entirely. She was halfway across the lobby, past the glass case that held the small worn boots that had first tangled her fate with Wade's, when the elevator doors opened, and Wade stepped out and stopped dead in his tracks, his face going white, with a horror Ivy had never seen on him before. "What is this?" he said, and his voice, usually so carefully controlled, cracked open with something raw and furious. "Take those off her. Now." "Sir, we have a formal report and documented evidence." "The evidence is fabricated," Wade said, closing the distance between them in 3 long strides, his eyes never leaving Ivy's face, taking in with visible anguish the sight of her standing handcuffed in the middle of his own company's lobby. "I have proof, right here, right now, that this was manufactured to frame her. Give me 1 hour before you take her anywhere. Sir, we have a job to do, and I have a lawyer standing 3 floors above us, and documentation proving exactly who forged those transfer records." Wade said, his voice rising now, carrying across the lobby with a force that made every head in the room turn. "This woman has done nothing wrong. Nothing. And the people responsible for this are standing in this building right now." He turned slowly and looked directly at Diana, whose careful mask of regret had begun visibly to crack. "You knew," he said quietly, and something in the quietness was more frightening than if he'd shouted. "You knew this whole time, didn't you?" Diana said nothing, her eyes darting toward the elevator, toward the exit, toward anywhere that wasn't the weight of Wade's gaze. Ivy stood frozen between them, wrists still bound, tears sliding silently down her face, caught in the wreckage of a plan built to destroy her, and watched through the blur of her own shock as the man who had once knelt in front of her as a boy with nothing but a scrap of leather and a promise now stood in front of an entire lobby of witnesses, refusing with every ounce of the power he'd spent 20 years building to let anyone take away the one thing he had left to protect. For a long moment, no one in the lobby moved. The 2 officers exchanged an uncertain glance, clearly unaccustomed to a suspect's employer, materializing mid-arrest with the kind of authority that made even law enforcement pause. The company attorney shifted his weight, suddenly less certain of the script he'd walked in with. And Diana Ashford stood very still near the security desk, her carefully composed expression finally visibly beginning to fracture. "Mr. Sutton," the lead officer said carefully, "I understand you're upset, but we can't simply release a suspect because you say the evidence is fabricated. We need something concrete." "You'll have it," Wade said, "in exactly the time it takes me to walk to my office and back. 1 hour. I'm asking you to hold everything until then. No transport, no booking, nothing final. 1 hour, and I will hand you proof that will change everything about this case." The officer studied him for a long moment, weighing the request against 20 years of built reputation, against the obvious wealth and influence radiating off a man who had never, according to anyone's account, misused either. 1 hour, he agreed, finally, "but she stays in custody until we see it." Wade turned to Ivy, his expression breaking open with something raw and helpless. "I am so sorry," he said, his voice unsteady. "I am going to fix this. I promise you, Ivy, I am going to fix this." "I know," Ivy whispered, though her voice shook as badly as her hands. "I believe you." It was in that moment, standing handcuffed in the lobby of a company that had felt for one brief and precious month like the first real home she'd ever known, that something in Ivy finally broke loose. Not despair, close, but something fiercer, something that had been building in her since she was a small girl learning to survive rooms full of people who had already decided what she was. She turned slowly to face Diana directly. "I know this was you," she said, and though her voice trembled, it did not waver. "I don't know exactly how you did it, but I know you've hated me since the day I walked into that interview, and I know you'd rather destroy an innocent person than admit that maybe, just maybe, I actually earned my place here." "That's a serious accusation," Diana said, but something in her voice had thinned brittle at the edges. "So is framing someone for theft," Ivy said. "You've spent weeks telling me I don't belong here, that people like me only understand survival. Well, you're right about one thing, Miss Ashford. I do understand survival. I've survived worse than a woman with a corner office and a grudge she's too much of a coward to admit to. And I am not going down without making sure everyone in this building knows exactly what you did to try to make me." The design floor had emptied out onto the mezzanine above the lobby. Dozens of employees pressed against the railing, watching the scene unfold below in a silence so complete, Ivy could hear her own pulse hammering in her ears. Earl stood among them, his weathered face taut with fury and helplessness in equal measure. Cal stood near the elevators, phone already pressed to his ear, coordinating with the attorney upstairs, his eyes flicking every few seconds toward Ivy, with an expression that had shifted in the space of a single terrible hour, from suspicion into something that looked almost like shame. "You don't know anything about me," Diana said, but her voice had gone thin, now defensive, in a way that sounded less like confidence and more like a woman watching her own careful architecture collapse in real time. "I know you've spent this whole time convinced I was after Wade's money," Ivy said. "I know you've never once considered that maybe I was just tired of being told I didn't deserve a chance before anyone bothered to actually give me one. And I know that whatever you built to try to bury me, it's going to come out. Because the truth always does eventually. It just usually takes longer for people like me to be believed." For a long, taut moment, no one spoke. Then Wade returned, moving fast across the lobby with a folder clutched in one hand, and Cal falling into step beside him, the attorney trailing a half step behind. He stopped in front of the officers and handed over the documents without ceremony, the forged transfer records, the login trail leading back to Margaret's assistant, the shell account buried 3 layers deep with Diana's name at its root. "Everything you need is right there," Wade said. "Timestamps, access logs, a financial trail that traces directly back to a shell account controlled by Diana Ashford, this company's vice president of operations. This woman," he gestured toward Ivy, his voice thick with something between fury and grief, "has never had access to the accounts in question, never touched a single dollar that wasn't hers. Everything about this arrest was manufactured, and I can prove exactly who manufactured it and why." The lead officer flipped through the documents slowly, his expression shifting from cautious skepticism to something considerably more serious as the evidence accumulated in front of him. He glanced up once at Diana, whose face had gone pale, her earlier composure entirely dissolved. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm going to need you to come with us instead." "This is absurd," Diana said, her voice climbing, panic finally breaking through the careful mask she'd worn for weeks. "You can't possibly believe." "I believe documented evidence," the officer said flatly. He turned to his partner, gave a small nod, and within moments, the handcuffs that had bound Ivy's wrists were transferred instead to Diana's, the sound of the metal closing around a different set of hands echoing through the same silent lobby that had less than an hour earlier watched an innocent woman led away in disgrace. Ivy rubbed her freed wrists, tears still tracking silently down her face, and looked up to find Wade, watching her with an expression she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Relief so profound it had visibly hollowed him out. Grief. For the mother, he now understood far too well, and something else beneath both of those things, steady and unshakable, that had clearly made up its mind about her long before this morning ever began. "I told you," he said softly, closing the distance between them. "I was going to fix it." "You did," Ivy said, and let herself finally fall into his arms in front of the entire company, in front of Earl and the craftsmen and Cal and the officers still finishing their paperwork nearby, no longer caring who saw, no longer caring what story it would become by lunchtime. Above them on the mezzanine, the assembled staff broke into scattered, disbelieving applause, quiet at first, then swelling the sound of an entire company watching an injustice undone in real time, and finding in that undoing something worth celebrating out loud. But as Wade held her, his chin resting against the top of her head, his eyes lifted briefly toward the elevators where his mother had just stepped out, drawn by the commotion, her face going ashen as she took in the scene before her, Diana in handcuffs. Ivy free, the truth. Finally, irreversibly out in the beat open. Margaret Sutton had arrived 1 hour too late to stop the truth from finding her. Margaret Sutton stood frozen at the edge of the lobby, her composure, the same composure she had spent 30 years perfecting, armor against every hardship, every loss, every inconvenient truth, visibly disintegrating in real time as she took in the scene before her. Diana in handcuffs, being led toward the door by 2 officers who no longer had any patience left for excuses. Ivy free, tear-streaked, wrapped in her son's arms in the middle of a lobby full of witnesses. And Wade, looking back at her now with an expression she had never once seen on his face in 38 years of raising him. Not anger exactly, though anger lived somewhere in it, but something far worse. Recognition. "Wade," she said carefully, taking a step forward. "What is going on here? You know exactly what's going on," Wade said. His voice had gone quiet again, the same dangerous quiet from the day before, and Ivy, still tucked against his side, felt him go rigid beside her. "Cal found everything, Mom. The transfer records, the shell account, Diana's name buried in it, and your assistant's login trail buried right alongside it." Margaret's face had gone the color of old paper. "I don't know what you think you found," don't, Wade said, and something in the single word carried enough weight that Margaret actually flinched. "Don't stand here and lie to me again. Not after everything else." Everything else, Margaret's voice wavered, uncertain now, in a way Ivy had not yet seen from her. Cal stepped forward, holding the second folder he had prepared that morning, the one neither of them had spoken about yet in front of anyone else. He looked at Wade, a silent question passing between 2 men who had shared nearly every hardship of their lives since childhood, and Wade gave a small, exhausted nod. "Show her," he said. Cal opened the folder and held it out. Margaret took it with visibly trembling hands, and as her eyes moved down the page, the old emails, the overruled objections, the quietly extended power of attorney, the physician's letter connecting a collapsed business deal to a heart that had finally 11 months later given out under the weight of it, the color that remained in her face drained away entirely. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. "It doesn't matter where I got it," Wade said. "What matters is that it's true. Isn't it?" Margaret said nothing. Her hands had begun to shake so badly that the papers rattled softly in the quiet lobby, and for a long, terrible moment Ivy watched a woman who had spent decades wielding control like a shield finally run out of places to hide. "I was trying to protect this family," Margaret said finally, her voice cracking. "Your father's investment instincts were too cautious. I thought I genuinely believed the deal I pushed for would set us up for the rest of our lives. I never imagined." She stopped, pressing a trembling hand against her mouth. "I never imagined it would cost him his life. And by the time it started to look that way, I couldn't undo any of it. All I could do was carry it. Alone. For 20 years. You let me believe it was bad luck," Wade said, and his voice, for the first time since the confrontation began, cracked open with something closer to grief than anger. "You let me spend my whole life thinking there was nothing anyone could have done. I built a promise to Hannah on that belief, Mom. I told myself the world was just cruel sometimes, that some things simply couldn't be helped. And the whole time you knew that wasn't entirely true. About Dad, at least." Margaret's composure finally completely gave way. She sank slowly onto the edge of a lobby bench, the folder still clutched in her lap, tears sliding down a face that had rarely in Wade's memory allowed itself to be seen crying at all. "I couldn't tell you," she said barely above a whisper. "I couldn't stand to watch you look at me the way you're looking at me right now. So I decided instead that I would spend the rest of my life making sure nothing like that ever touched this family again. I controlled everything I could control, because the one thing I couldn't control, the guilt, the grief, what I'd done, I simply buried and told myself. Burying it was the same thing as making peace with it. She looked up at Ivy, then her eyes red-rimmed and raw. And when I saw you, I think some part of me saw everything I was afraid of. A version of poverty and loss I recognized far too well. I told myself I was protecting Wade from making my mistakes. But I think really I was just afraid that if he let himself love someone the way I once loved his father foolishly, completely without calculating the cost, he'd end up carrying the same kind of grief I've carried every day since. That's not an excuse for what you let happen to Ivy, Wade said, though the edge in his voice had softened just slightly under the weight of his mother's confession. I know, Margaret said. I know it isn't. I let my fear turn into something cruel, and I let Diana's ambition become a weapon I should have stopped the moment I understood what she intended to do. She looked at Ivy directly, something raw and unguarded in her expression that Ivy had not expected to ever see from her. I am sorry. Truly. I let 20 years of grief convince me that controlling everything was the same thing as protecting it. I was wrong. About the company, about my son, and about you. Ivy studied her for a long moment. This woman who had investigated her insulted her, nearly allowed her to be destroyed, and felt beneath the ache of everything she had endured something unexpected, rising in its place. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet. But the beginning of understanding, the same understanding she had learned slowly and painfully to extend to every broken person she had ever met in the system that raised her that cruelty more often than anyone wanted to admit, was simply pain that had never learned a gentler way to survive. I know what it's like to carry something alone for so long it starts to feel like the only way to hold yourself together, Ivy said quietly. I'm not going to pretend what happened today didn't hurt. It did. But I understand grief that turns into control, Mrs. Sutton. I've watched it happen to people my whole life. I don't forgive it easily, but I understand it. Margaret's breath caught something in her face, breaking open at the unexpected grace in Ivy's words. Grace she had done nothing by any reasonable measure to deserve. Wade reached down and took his mother's hand, an old complicated tenderness moving across his face despite everything. We have a lot to talk about, he said quietly. All three of us. But not today. Today I just need you to understand that whatever else happens, I am not walking away from her. Not for the company, not for you, not for anyone. Margaret nodded, slowly, tears still falling, and for the first time in longer than Wade could remember, she did not argue. The days that followed moved with the strange, disorienting slowness of a life recalibrating itself after disaster. Diana Ashford was formally charged within the week. Fraud, falsification of financial records, and filing a false police report chief among the counts. The district attorney's office eventually brought against her. She resigned from Sutton Boot and Leather Company before the board could vote to remove her, though the distinction meant little to anyone who had watched her handcuffed and led from the lobby in front of the entire staff. Her name was quietly stripped from the company directory within days, her office cleared out by a moving crew while most of the design floor was still at lunch, as though the building itself wanted to erase the memory of her as quickly and cleanly as possible. Ivy gave her statement to detectives twice each time, with Wade sitting beside her, and each time felt the same strange mixture of relief and exhaustion. Relief that the truth had finally been believed, exhaustion at how narrowly it had come to not being believed at all. She thought more than once in those long, careful interviews of every moment in her life when the truth alone had not been enough to save her. Every caseworker and teacher and stranger who had looked at her circumstances rather than her character and decided long before she'd had the chance to speak exactly what kind of person she must be. This time finally evidence and belief had arrived together in time. She understood with a quiet ache exactly how rare that combination had been for her whole life. Cal came to see her on the third day, finding her alone at her workbench during the lunch hour, the design floor quiet around them. He stood for a long moment before speaking, visibly uncertain, a man unused to apologizing, and clearly determined to do it properly anyway. I owe you something, he said finally. You don't owe me anything, Cal. I do. He sat down heavily on the stool across from her, turning a scrap of leather over in his hands, not quite meeting her eyes. I spent weeks assuming the worst about you, digging through your life looking for the angle I was sure had to be there. And what I found instead was a woman who gave away money she couldn't afford to give to a stranger, who'll never know her name, and who never once in any of it asked for anything back. He finally looked up. I was wrong about you, Ivy. Not a little wrong. Completely wrong. And I let that wrongness sit in a room with you for weeks, watching you, suspecting you, when what you actually deserved was somebody in Wade's corner willing to see you clearly from the start. You were trying to protect your best friend, Ivy said gently. I understand that better than you might think. I've spent my whole life learning to be careful about who I trust too. I don't fault you for being careful about who he trusts. Most people wouldn't be this generous about it, Cal said. Most people haven't needed as much grace given to them as I have, Ivy said simply. It's easier to extend something you know firsthand, what it feels like to need. Cal was quiet for a moment, something shifting behind his guarded expression, the last visible remnant of suspicion, finally fully giving way to something warmer. For what it's worth, he said, I've known Wade since we were 9 years old, sharing a bag of chips, because neither of us had enough money for our own lunch. I have never in nearly 30 years seen him let anyone all the way in. Not really. Not even me, not entirely. Not until that conversation at the cemetery he told me about after the fact. He shook his head slowly, a small, rueful smile finally breaking through. Whatever you did to earn that kind of trust from him, Ivy, you didn't do it by scheming. I see that now. I should have seen it a lot sooner. Thank you, Cal, Ivy said softly. Don't thank me yet, he said, standing, some of his old gruffness returning even as warmth remained underneath it. I'm still going to be watching out for both of you, just for entirely different reasons now. He left her smiling quietly for the first time in days without an edge of exhaustion behind it. Margaret's reckoning took longer and unfolded with far less public drama than Diana's, though it cut in its own way far deeper. She stepped back from her informal role, advising the company's board, a position she had held unofficially for years, and began haltingly and without ceremony, a kind of penance that showed itself less in grand gestures than in small, careful changes. A handwritten letter to Ivy, delivered quietly, rather than announced. A visit to Sutton House, her first in over a decade, where she sat for nearly an hour with the current director going over the home's actual unglamorous financial needs, rather than simply writing a check and leaving. A long, difficult conversation with Wade late one evening, that neither of them ever fully described to anyone else, but that left him the next morning quieter and lighter in a way Ivy noticed immediately without needing to ask why. She asked me, Wade told Ivy one evening, sitting together on the small porch outside her apartment, whether I could ever forgive her. For all of it. My father. The years of pretending it was simple bad luck. What she let happen to you. What did you tell her? Ivy asked. That forgiveness isn't something I can hand over all at once like flipping a switch, Wade said. But that I was willing to try. Slowly. If she was willing to actually change instead of just apologizing and going back to the same patterns the moment the shock wore off. He looked over at Ivy, something steady and grateful in his expression. I don't think I would have had the strength to say any of that a month ago. I think I would have just kept absorbing it the way I always have, quietly, alone, the way I absorbed everything else since Hannah. Ivy reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. You're not carrying it alone anymore. No, Wade agreed softly, looking out at the quiet street, the porch light casting a warm gold circle around them in the gathering dark. I'm not. They sat together for a long while in comfortable silence, the events of the past weeks finally beginning to settle into something that felt less like wreckage and more like ground being cleared for something new, a company steadier than it had been in years, a mother beginning, however imperfectly, to the change, a best friend who had traded suspicion for loyalty, and between the two of them, something that had started as an unlikely kindness between a boy and a little girl in a basement workshop and had grown 20 years later into a love neither of them had expected, but both of them finally felt ready to build a life around. 6 months passed, and the anniversary gala for Sutton Boot and Leather Company arrived on a clear autumn evening. The ballroom of one of Fort Worth's oldest hotels filled with employees, longtime clients, and members of the press who had, in the months since Diana's arrest and the quiet unraveling of old family secrets, grown considerably more curious about the story behind the company's usually private founder. Wade stood backstage for a long moment before he was due to speak, adjusting his tie with hands that, despite everything he had built and everything he had survived, still trembled slightly before any moment that mattered. Ivy stood beside him, radiant in a simple dress, the color of good leather, her hand resting steady against his arm. You don't have to do this tonight, she said quietly. Nobody's asking you to say all of it out loud. I know, Wade said. But I want to. I've spent 20 years letting people believe whatever story about me was easiest for them to swallow. I think it's time they heard the real one. He walked out onto the stage to warm, expectant applause, and stood for a moment behind the podium looking out over a room full of people who had in one way or another built their livelihoods on the promise of a company that had started with nothing but a boy, a basement workshop, and a grief he had never once spoken about publicly. 20 years ago he began his voice steady, despite the weight of what he was about to say. I was a 17-year-old kid living at a group home on the east side of this city with a little sister named Hannah, and absolutely nothing else to my name. That winter Hannah got sick. The home didn't have the resources to get her the care she needed in time, and I lost her. I was 15 years old, and I made myself a promise that day that I have carried mostly in silence. For every year since that I would spend my life making sure no child in that position ever again went without the help they needed. A hush fell over the room, the kind of silence that comes when a story shifts unexpectedly from expected celebration into something far more human. I built this company one boot at a time out of that grief, Wade continued. And for 20 years I've funded Sutton House anonymously quietly because I told myself the giving mattered more than anyone knowing my name attached to it. But this year I learned something important from someone who reminded me that hiding your story doesn't protect you from your pain. It just makes you carry it alone. He looked toward the side of the stage where Ivy stood watching him with tears already gathering in her eyes. So tonight I'm not hiding anymore. Tonight I'm announcing the Hannah Sutton wing at Sutton House, fully funded, permanently staffed, with a medical fund attached that will make sure no child there ever again has to wait for care that comes too late. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Wade held up a hand asking for one more moment. I also want to say something about the woman standing beside me tonight, he said, and Ivy felt her breath catch as he reached out a hand toward her, inviting her onto the stage. She crossed toward him, slowly aware of every eye in the room. Ivy Malone grew up at Sutton House 2 years after I left it. She wore a pair of boots I made for her as a little girl back when I had nothing else to give anyone. I didn't know until a few months ago that the two of us had been quietly tied together since long before either of us understood what that meant. She has taught me in the short time I've known her that the hardest things we survive don't have to stay buried to be honored. Sometimes they're the very things that lead us back to exactly where we're supposed to be. He turned to her, and the room seemed to hold its breath as he reached into his jacket pocket and knelt slowly in front of several hundred witnesses. Ivy, he said, his voice rough with emotion, you found me long before either of us knew it. You've carried more than anyone should ever have to carry, and you did it with more grace and more strength than I have ever seen in another person. I don't want to spend the rest of my life hiding my story or building something good out of grief alone. I want to build it with you. Will you marry me? Ivy, tears streaming freely now, nodded before she could even find her voice, and the room erupted into applause so loud it seemed to shake the old chandeliers overhead. Cal, standing near the front with a grin he made no effort to hide, clapped harder than anyone in the room. And near the back, quietly, Margaret Sutton stood with tears of her own sliding down her face, no longer trying to control the story unfolding in front of her, only grateful finally to be allowed to witness it. There is a lesson in Wade and Ivy's story that reaches far beyond one company, one family, or one act of long overdue justice. It is a lesson about what happens when we let grief calcify into silence instead of letting it become the foundation for compassion. It is a lesson about how easily fear can disguise itself as protection, and how much healing becomes possible the moment we finally choose honesty over the comfort of a carefully managed story. And it is a lesson about how the smallest act of kindness, a pair of hand-stitched boots, given to a cold, frightened child who had nothing, can travel quietly through the years and return when we least expect it as something powerful, enough to heal a wound we thought we would carry alone, forever. Responsibility in this story was never about a company or a fortune. It was about a promise kept to a little sister who never got the chance to grow up. Protection was never about control. It was about standing beside someone publicly and without apology when the world tried to tear them down. And healing in the end came not from wealth or power, but from two people willing to finally tell each other the truth. If this story moved you, we would love to hear from you. What lesson did you take away from Wade and Ivy's journey? Was it the importance of honesty, the power of quiet generosity, or the reminder that the wounds we hide often shape us more than the ones we let others see? Share your thoughts. In the comments below, we read every single one, and your reflections mean more to this community than you know. If you enjoyed this story, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who might need to hear it today, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe so you never miss the next story. Thank you so much for watching and for being part of this journey with us. See you again in the next video.